I arrived at my wife's company's party. My wife's boss and lover snapped at security, escorted him out. I was disgraced in front of 300 employees. I didn't invite you. Why did you come? My wife smirked. Few seconds later, every screen flashed. Primary key missing. Her boss screamed, "Fix it now." The whole room erupted into chaos. You ever walk into a party and instantly know you weren't supposed to be there? I'm not talking about showing up to the wrong barbecue in flip-flops when everyone else is in business casual. I'm talking about that bone-deep, stomach-dropping realization that you've just stepped into a room full of people who would rather chew glass than acknowledge your existence. Yeah, that was me tonight, walking into my wife's company anniversary gala like some kind of optimistic idiot, tux freshly pressed, because apparently I thought looking good would somehow make this less humiliating, cologne whispering expensive forgiveness into the air around me, and holding a bouquet of roses that now felt less like a romantic gesture and more like an unpaid invoice I was trying to collect on. The Grandview Hotel ballroom was one of those places that screamed, "We have money and we want you to know it," with its crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls of pretension, marble floors so polished you could probably perform open-heart surgery on them, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline that made everyone inside feel like they were masters of the universe. The whole place smelled like champagne, overpriced catering, and the distinct aroma of corporate backstabbing masked with expensive perfume. I'd been to this hotel before, back when Serena and I were actually happy, back when she dragged me to these things and introduced me as my brilliant husband, instead of pretending I was some kind of restraining order waiting to happen. The moment I stepped through those massive glass doors, the room went quiet. And I don't mean the polite kind of quiet where people pause mid-conversation to see who just arrived. I mean the kind of silence that drops like a guillotine blade, where 300 pairs of eyes suddenly lock onto you like you're a disease they're all terrified of catching. The string quartet in the corner actually hit a sour note, which honestly felt appropriate. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. Even the waiters stopped moving, frozen like someone had hit pause on reality itself. And there, standing near the center of it all in a dress that probably cost more than my first car, was my wife Serena, looking at me like I was a cockroach that had somehow learned to wear a tuxedo. Her face went through about 15 emotions in 2 seconds flat: surprise, annoyance, anger, calculation, and finally settling on that ice-cold mask of indifference she'd perfected over the past 6 months. Next to her, with his hand resting just a little too comfortably on the small of her back, was Eric Langford himself, her boss, her mentor, and apparently the guy who thought my marriage vows came with an expiration date and a corporate buyout clause. Eric was one of those guys who looked like he'd been genetically engineered in a lab specifically to run tech companies into the ground while somehow getting richer in the process. Mid-40s, salt and pepper hair styled within an inch of its life, a smile that had probably been focus grouped for maximum trustworthiness, and a handshake that could crush coal into diamonds while simultaneously making you feel like you owed him money. Right now, that smile was nowhere to be found. Instead, he was glaring at me like I'd just walked into his house, kicked his dog, and insulted his mother's cooking, all while tracking mud across his white carpet. "Security," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife through butter, smooth and cold, and absolutely certain of its authority. "Escort him out." I almost laughed. Actually, I did laugh. A short, sharp bark of amusement that echoed inappropriately across the now silent ballroom. Because here's the thing about Eric Langford and his perfectly orchestrated corporate events. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to remove me from a room I'd paid for. 6 months ago, it was the conference room where I'd built their entire digital infrastructure. 3 months ago, it was the office I'd worked in for 2 years without a single day off. And now it was this glittering monument to success built on the foundation I'd laid, brick by digital brick, line by line of code, while everyone else was busy networking and playing office politics. 2 security guards materialized from somewhere near the walls, both of them looking like they'd been ordered from the same catalog: broad shoulders, blank expressions, earpieces that probably connected them to some command center where someone was giving them instructions on how to remove the crazy ex-husband without causing a scene. They started moving toward me with that particular walk that security guys have, purposeful but not quite running, trying to look professional while also conveying that they were absolutely prepared to drag me out by my ankles if necessary. My wife, because she was still technically my wife, even if she'd clearly moved on to her upgrade model, finally found her voice. "I didn't invite you," Serena said, her tone dripping with that particular brand of condescension she'd developed somewhere between our last anniversary and her first business trip with Eric. "Why did you come?" It was a good question, actually. Why had I come? Was it because I still loved her, despite everything? Was it because some stupid, optimistic part of my brain thought that maybe, just maybe, showing up with flowers and wearing my best tux would somehow magically fix the smoking crater where our marriage used to be? Or was it because I knew exactly what was about to happen, and I wanted a front row seat to the show? I smiled at her. Not the warm, genuine smile I used to reserve for her when she'd laugh at my jokes or fall asleep on my shoulder during bad movies, but something sharper, something with edges. "Because you used my software to organize this event," I said, keeping my voice conversational, like we were discussing the weather or what to have for dinner, not the systematic dismantling of everything we'd built together. She blinked. Just once, but it was enough. That tiny moment of uncertainty, that flicker of something that might have been memory or realization or "oh shit, I forgot about," that crossing her perfectly made-up face. Her boss didn't blink, though. Eric Langford had spent too many years in boardrooms and shareholder meetings to give anything away that easily. But I saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his hand dropped from Serena's back, saw the microscopic calculation happening behind those cold, shark-like eyes. The security guards were closer now, probably debating whether to grab me immediately or wait for another signal from their boss. The entire room was watching this play out like it was the most entertaining thing that had happened at a corporate event since someone got drunk and photocopied their ass at the Christmas party. I could see phones coming out, people probably already texting their work friends about the drama unfolding, social media posts being composed in real time about the crazy husband who crashed his wife's work gala. But here's what none of them knew. What Serena had apparently forgotten in her rush to climb the corporate ladder using my back as a stepping stool. What Eric had never bothered to figure out because he was too busy thinking he was the smartest guy in every room he walked into. The system they were using to run this entire event, from the digital invitations to the automated check-in process to the presentations that were probably queued up to play on those massive screens behind the stage, all of it ran on code I'd written. Infrastructure I'd built. Architecture I designed during countless sleepless nights while Serena slept peacefully in our bed, back when she still called it our bed instead of my bed. And systems, unlike people, don't forget who their real owner is. I stood there in my pressed tux, holding my bouquet of roses like a shield, watching the security guards approach and my wife pretend not to know me and her boss try to decide whether I was a legitimate threat or just a pathetic ex-husband making a scene, and I smiled. Because in about 90 seconds, when those presentations were supposed to start, when Eric was scheduled to take the stage and talk about innovation and success and the bright future of Nexus Data Labs, every single person in this room was going to learn a very important lesson about the difference between using something and owning it. The backup, as they say, is nothing without the original. And I was definitely the original. Rewind 2 years earlier, back when I still believed in things like merit and loyalty and the idea that if you worked hard enough, people would actually appreciate what you did for them instead of stabbing you in the back with the same knife you sharpened for them. Nexus Data Labs was struggling harder than a fish out of water, gasping for air in a market that was moving faster than their outdated servers could handle. Their infrastructure was basically held together with duct tape, prayers, and the IT equivalent of crossing your fingers really hard and hoping nothing exploded during business hours. They needed something solid, something that wouldn't collapse faster than their moral compass, which I didn't realize at the time was already pretty much non-existent. So when my old college buddy Marcus, good guy, terrible judge of character, called me up and said his company was looking for someone to rebuild their entire digital backbone from scratch, I figured why not. I was freelancing anyway, living in a decent apartment in the city, spending most of my nights teaching myself new programming languages for fun because apparently I was the kind of guy who thought debugging code was a legitimate form of entertainment. I built it. From scratch. No sleep for 3 months straight. Just an unholy amount of caffeine that probably could have powered a small city, Takeout containers stacked so high they became load-bearing structures in my apartment, and the kind of stubbornness that comes from knowing you're creating something beautiful even if nobody else understands it yet. I designed a system that was elegant, efficient, and so secure it would take a team of hackers about 50 years to crack it. And that's if they knew what they were looking for. Every line of code was mine. Every security protocol, every backup system, every failsafe. I even built in redundancies for the redundancies, because I'm nothing if not thorough. That's when I met Serena. She was working in their business development department, charming clients during the day and apparently charming me during those late nights when she'd bring coffee to the server room where I was basically living like some kind of code-writing hermit. She was brilliant in that way that makes you forget to breathe for a second. Sharp as hell, quick with comebacks, ambitious enough to want more than what she had, but not so ambitious that I thought she'd sacrifice everything to get it. The holy trinity of future heartbreak, as it turned out. But hindsight is 20/20, and I was wearing beer goggles made of optimism and loneliness. We started dating about 4 months into the project. She'd laugh at my terrible programming jokes, the ones that only worked if you understood Boolean logic and had given up on having a normal social life. We'd grab dinner at this terrible Chinese place around the corner from the office that had probably failed 3 health inspections but made the best dumplings in the city. She told me about her dreams of making it big in tech, about proving everyone wrong who said she couldn't succeed without a computer science degree, about wanting to build something that mattered. And like an idiot, I believed we were building it together. I built the system. She built her reputation on my system. Funny how that works, right? Suddenly Serena was the golden girl of Nexus Data Labs, the one who revolutionized their digital infrastructure, according to the company newsletter that didn't bother to mention my name even once. She gave presentations using slides I'd helped her make, explaining concepts I'd spent hours teaching her over coffee and late-night phone calls, taking credit for innovations that came from my brain while I stayed in the background like a stage hand who never gets to take a bow. And then there was Eric Langford, the CEO who walked around the office like he'd personally invented the internet and was just waiting for everyone to thank him for it. When he realized I was the quiet genius behind their success, and by realized, I mean when the system nearly crashed one day and suddenly everyone remembered that, oh yeah, there's actually a guy who built this thing and maybe we should be nicer to him. He smiled that CEO smile that means, let's use him until we don't need him anymore. It's the same smile sharks probably have right before they bite. All teeth and no warmth, calculated down to the exact angle that looks friendly in photographs. Eric started inviting me to meetings, patting me on the back like we were old friends, talking about bringing me into the fold and recognizing my contributions with stock options that were basically monopoly money printed on expensive paper. He'd ask my opinion on things and then immediately do the opposite while somehow making it sound like it was my idea all along. The guy was a magician, really. He could make your value disappear while convincing you that you should be grateful for the opportunity to watch. Spoiler alert, they decided they didn't need me about 18 months later, right after I finished implementing the last major upgrade and trained their in-house team on basic maintenance. Suddenly my contract wasn't being renewed, my access was being temporarily restricted for security purposes, and Serena was coming home later and later from important meetings that apparently required her to wear perfume that cost more than our rent. But here's the thing about systems, the thing that Eric and Serena and everyone else at Nexus Data Labs didn't bother to understand because they were too busy counting their money and planning their next power play. Systems remember. They know their real owner. Every line of code I wrote had my fingerprints all over it, my logic, my way of thinking, my particular brand of problem solving that you can't just copy-paste or reverse engineer without understanding the mind that created it. I built backdoors into that system, not for anything malicious, just standard administrator access that any smart developer includes for maintenance and emergency fixes. Primary keys that only I knew about, authentication protocols that required credentials only I possessed, failsafes that would activate if someone tried to lock me out completely. It was like building a house and keeping a master key, except this house was made of data and ran a multi-million-dollar company, and that master key was about to become very, very relevant. They thought they could use me and lose me, thought they could take my work and cut me out like I was some expendable contractor they could replace with anyone who knew how to Google Python tutorial. But the thing about building something from scratch is that it's yours in ways that go deeper than contracts or paychecks or legal ownership. It knows you. It responds to you. And when pushed, it protects you. They just didn't know that yet. The signs were there, bright and obvious as neon billboards on a highway, screaming, "Your wife is cheating on you," in letters tall enough to see from space. But like most people who don't want to believe their world is crumbling around them, I spent a solid 2 months convincing myself I was imagining things, that I was being crazy, that there had to be some perfectly reasonable explanation for why my wife was suddenly acting like a completely different person. It started with the mysterious team dinners that somehow never included me, even though I'd met most of her team, and they all seemed to think I was a pretty okay guy. Serena would get dolled up like she was going to the Oscars, not drinks with Karen from accounting and Brad from marketing, wearing dresses I'd never seen before that must have cost a fortune we supposedly didn't have. When I'd ask if I could tag along, she'd give me this look like I'd just suggested showing up to a business meeting in my underwear. "It's work stuff. You'd be bored," she'd say, kissing my cheek with lips that tasted like lies and expensive lipstick. "Don't wait up." Then there was the perfume. Serena had worn the same perfume since I'd met her, something light and flowery that reminded me of spring, the kind of scent that made you think of sunshine and possibilities. But suddenly, about 3 months after my contract wasn't renewed, she switched to something else entirely. Something heavier, muskier, more expensive. The kind of perfume that didn't whisper, it announced. It screamed, "I'm important, I'm successful, I'm going places," in a cloud of corporate ambition that probably cost $200 an ounce. "New perfume?" I asked one night, trying to sound casual and probably failing miserably. "Oh, this?" "Eric gave it to the whole executive team for hitting our quarterly targets," she said, not even looking up from her phone. Eric. Of course it was Eric. Because nothing says professional workplace gift like expensive French perfume that probably came in a box wrapped with more care than she'd shown our marriage in months. And then there was the phone. The new phone that appeared out of nowhere, sleeker and more expensive than the one she already had, which was already pretty damn nice. She guarded that thing like it contained nuclear launch codes or the secret to immortality. It never left her sight. She took it to the bathroom. She slept with it under her pillow. She'd angle it away from me when texting, fingers flying across the screen with the kind of urgency usually reserved for hostage negotiations or stock market crashes. "Who are you texting?" I asked one evening while we were supposedly watching a movie together, though together was generous since she'd barely looked at the screen in 45 minutes. "Just work stuff," she said, that automatic response that people use when they've practiced lying so much it becomes second nature. Crisis with the Johnson account. Funny thing about the Johnson account, it didn't exist. I knew because I'd built the client database myself, and I'd spent enough time reviewing their systems to know every major account they had. But sure, Serena, tell me more about this fictional crisis that requires you to smile at your phone like it just told you a joke. When I finally confronted her, really confronted her, not the passive-aggressive hints or the casual questions, but the full, "I know something's going on, and you need to tell me the truth" confrontation, she didn't even have the decency to look guilty. We were in our kitchen, that kitchen where we'd cooked dinners together and laughed over terrible cooking attempts, and talked about maybe getting a dog someday when we had more space. Now it just felt like a stage set for a play about a marriage that had already ended. We just hadn't gotten around to announcing it yet. "You're paranoid," she said, loading the dishwasher with the kind of aggressive precision that meant she was definitely not paranoid and I was definitely onto something. "You've been weird ever since you stopped working at Nexus. Maybe if you got another job instead of moping around here, you wouldn't have time to invent problems." Yeah, because paranoia is totally unreasonable when your wife's late-night meetings involve candlelight and her boss's Tesla, that obnoxiously expensive silver one with the vanity plates that said "Shrupt," parked outside Marcello's, the Italian place downtown that cost about $300 a meal and definitely wasn't serving the Johnson account crisis special. I knew because I'd driven past there one Thursday evening when she said she was working late at the office, and there it was, Eric's car gleaming under the streetlights like evidence in a crime scene. I didn't tell her I'd seen it. Didn't mention that I'd also noticed the credit card charges for lingerie I'd never seen her wear, or the way she'd changed her computer password from our anniversary date to something I couldn't guess, or how she'd started going to the gym at 6 in the morning when she used to complain that anything before 9 a.m. was cruel and unusual punishment. So I did what any calm, intelligent, definitely not planning revenge man would do. I waited. Quietly. With receipts. Digital ones, mostly, because that's my specialty. Bank statements, location data from the car's GPS that she forgot I had access to, calendar invites that didn't quite match up with her stories. I compiled it all like I was building a database, because essentially that's what it was, a comprehensive archive of betrayal, meticulously organized and backed up in 3 separate locations because I'm nothing if not thorough. And while she was busy building her career on the foundation of my work and Eric's sleazy mentorship, I was doing something else entirely. I was rewriting the source code, accessing those systems I'd built through backdoors only I knew existed, making small changes here and there that wouldn't be noticeable until they needed to be noticed. Administrative privileges that I'd supposedly lost? Still there, just hidden better. Authentication protocols that should have locked me out? Cute, but I built those locks, and I kept the keys. Revenge wasn't exactly the plan. That makes it sound premeditated and malicious, like I was some kind of villain twirling his mustache and plotting elaborate schemes. No, this was more like insurance. A safety net. A software update that would activate when the time was right. When the universe decided that Eric and Serena needed a reminder that you can't just delete the creator from his own creation. It was just the inevitable consequence of forgetting who really owned the system they were all celebrating. And that time, as it turned out, was coming faster than they thought. Back to the party, where the champagne flowed like water and the fake laughter echoed off the marble walls like a symphony of insincerity. Everyone was dressed to the nines, wearing their success like armor, air-kissing each other's cheeks while probably calculating whose career they could step on to climb one rung higher on the corporate ladder. This was the kind of event where people pretended to like each other for 3 hours, then went home and shit-talked everyone they'd just toasted to on their group chats. I positioned myself near the bar, partially because I needed something to do with my hands and partially because bartenders see everything and judge nothing, making them the most honest people in any room full of liars. The bartender tonight was this guy named Miguel who'd clearly worked enough corporate events to know exactly what he was looking at. A man who'd just walked into his own public humiliation and was somehow smiling about it. He poured me a sparkling water without me even asking, sliding it across the polished counter with the kind of knowing look that said, "I got you, buddy." I sipped that sparkling water like it was vintage whiskey, because someone had to stay sober enough to enjoy what was coming. And it definitely wasn't going to be the CFO, who was already 3 martinis deep and laughing too loud at jokes that weren't funny. Around me, Nexus Data Lab's finest were networking with the intensity of sharks circling chum, exchanging business cards and LinkedIn profiles like they were trading baseball cards, everyone trying to out-important each other with stories about deals they'd closed and clients they'd landed. I recognized most of them. There was Janet from HR, who'd sent me the "thank you for your service" email when they'd terminated my contract, dressed in a pantsuit that probably cost more than they'd paid me in my last month. Richard from sales was holding court near the hors d'oeuvres table, telling the same exaggerated story about landing the Peterson account that I'd heard at least 5 times, conveniently leaving out the part where the system I'd built was the only reason they could handle Peterson's data requirements. And there was Amanda, one of the junior developers I'd actually trained, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable when she caught my eye from across the room. Then Serena made her entrance, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees just from the ice in her veins. She strutted across that ballroom floor in her silver dress like she owned the place, heels clicking against marble with the confidence of someone who'd forgotten that confidence and I used to build together, back when we were a team instead of whatever legal definition our marriage had been reduced to. Her hair was done up in some complicated style that probably required an engineering degree to achieve. Makeup flawless. Every inch of her screaming, "I made it, and I don't need you anymore." Eric appeared at her side like a trained dog, except this dog drove a Tesla and made 7 figures a year. He had his hand on her lower back again, that possessive gesture that made my jaw clench, and they worked the room together like a presidential couple on the campaign trail, shaking hands and accepting congratulations for a success story that conveniently forgot to mention the guy who'd actually written the code that made it all possible. The string quartet switched to something triumphant and insufferable as Eric moved toward the small stage they'd set up near the massive screens. Someone handed him a microphone, and the lights dimmed slightly for dramatic effect, because apparently this wasn't just a company anniversary party. It was a TED Talk waiting to happen. Eric tapped his champagne glass with that little fork thing that rich people use to get attention, and the room obediently quieted down like school children when the principal walks in. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eric began, his voice booming through the sound system with practiced ease. "Tonight we celebrate innovation and loyalty." I almost choked on my sparkling water. Innovation? Sure, if you count stealing someone else's work as innovation. Loyalty? Coming from the guy who'd called me background noise in an email that was accidentally CC'd to me instead of just Serena, an email where he'd literally written, "We can replace him with any competent developer once the system is stable." I'd saved that email, obviously, because I'm not an idiot, and it was currently sitting in a folder labeled Receipts, along with about 40 other pieces of evidence that these people were terrible human beings. Security was still hovering near me. These two guys built like refrigerators in cheap suits, watching me like I might suddenly flip a table or start screaming profanities at the happy couple on stage. One of them, the shorter one with the buzz cut, kept touching his earpiece like he was receiving updates from Mission Control about the dangerous ex-husband situation. I gave him a friendly wave. The buzz-cut guy did not wave back. Eric continued his speech, something about building the future together and the power of teamwork and other corporate buzzwords that probably sounded profound to people who'd had too much champagne, but really just meant, "We made money and we're proud of ourselves." People nodded along like he was revealing the secrets of the universe instead of reading from the same playbook every tech CEO has used since Silicon Valley became a thing. Serena stood near the stage, beaming up at Eric like he'd just discovered fire, her face a mask of admiration that I used to think was reserved for me back when I was naive enough to believe that love meant something more than convenience and career advancement. She applauded at all the right moments, laughed at his jokes that weren't actually jokes, played her role perfectly in this theater of corporate ambition. Behind them, those massive screens displayed the Nexus Data Labs logo, pulsing gently with animations that I designed during a 72-hour coding marathon fueled by energy drinks and the mistaken belief that hard work would be rewarded. The irony wasn't lost on me. Nothing about this situation was lost on me. I checked my watch. Any minute now, Eric was going to transition from his speech into the big presentation, the one where they'd showcase all their achievements and growth metrics and profit margins, all displayed through the system that apparently didn't need its creator anymore. The presentation that required administrator access to run properly, access that they thought they had but really didn't. Miguel the bartender caught my eye and raised an eyebrow, a silent question of whether I needed anything stronger than sparkling water for whatever was about to happen. I shook my head. I wanted to remember every single second of this with perfect clarity. On stage, Eric raised his glass for a toast, and 300 people raised theirs in response. A sea of champagne flutes glittering under the chandelier light, like complicit witnesses to their own upcoming disaster. "To Nexus Data Labs," Eric proclaimed, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction, "and to the brilliant future we're building together." I raised my sparkling water, smiling like I was in on the joke. I was the only one who knew the punchline was about to hit. Eric pointed at me again, his finger jabbing through the air like he was trying to physically push me out of the building through sheer force of will. His face had gone that particular shade of red that powerful men turn when someone has the audacity to not immediately obey them, like a tomato having an existential crisis. I said, "Escort him out." He barked at the security guards, who honestly looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else than in the middle of this increasingly awkward domestic situation masquerading as a security threat. The two guards grabbed my arms with the kind of gentle firmness that suggested they were trying to do their jobs without actually hurting anyone or becoming YouTube famous for excessive force. "Sir, please leave quietly," the buzzcut one said, his voice surprisingly polite considering his boss was practically frothing at the mouth behind him. I looked at both of them, then at Eric, then at the 300 people watching this unfold like it was the season finale of their favorite drama series. Quietly, I laughed, the sound echoing across the now silent ballroom in a way that probably made me look unhinged, But honestly, I'd pass caring about that somewhere around the time I found out my wife was screwing her boss. Sure, I can do quiet, but you might want to back up your data first. It was such a casual comment, delivered with the kind of tone you'd use to mention that it might rain later or that the coffee was getting cold. But I saw it, that microscopic flicker of uncertainty that crossed Eric's face, the way his eyes narrowed just slightly, the mental calculation happening behind them as his brain tried to figure out if I was bluffing or if I actually had the power to do what I was implying. That's when the lights dimmed. Just slightly, just enough for people to notice, just enough for conversations to pause mid-sentence and heads to turn upward toward the chandeliers like maybe the hotel was having electrical issues. But I knew better. The hotel's electrical system was fine. It was the massive power draw from the screens behind the stage suddenly trying to load data that wasn't there anymore, processors working overtime to find files that had been quietly relocated to places only I could access. I smiled. I couldn't help it. It was like watching the first domino tip over in a chain reaction you'd spent months setting up. One of the engineers from Nexus's IT department, a nervous kid named Tyler who looked like he'd graduated college about 15 minutes ago, appeared from the wings of the stage area, his tablet clutched in his hands like a life preserver, sweat already forming on his forehead. He whispered something urgently to Eric, gesturing at his screen with the kind of frantic energy that usually precedes very bad news. Eric waved him off with the irritated dismissal of someone who'd spent his entire career believing that technical problems could be solved by simply telling them to go away. "Restart it," he said, not even looking at Tyler, still too focused on glaring at me like I was personally responsible for every inconvenience he'd ever experienced. Which, to be fair, I was about to be. Tyler scurried away like a kicked puppy, probably already texting the rest of the IT team with a message that roughly translated to "we're so screwed." I watched him go, still held by the two security guards who were getting increasingly uncomfortable with their role in this little drama. "Yeah, Eric," I said, my voice carrying across the quiet room with perfect clarity. "Restart it. That should definitely help. Have you tried turning it off and on again?" A few people actually laughed at that. Nervous, quickly suppressed laughter, but laughter nonetheless. The kind that escapes when tension gets so thick you either laugh or scream. And most people in corporate America have been trained since birth to never scream in public. Even Serena's perfectly maintained composure cracked for just a second, her eyes widening as she finally seemed to realize that maybe I hadn't shown up tonight just to cause a scene. Maybe I'd shown up for something far more calculated. The screens behind Eric, those massive displays that were supposed to show graphs and metrics and all the proof of Nexus Data Labs' incredible success, flickered once, then twice, then went completely black, like someone had pulled the plug on the entire presentation, except nobody had touched any plugs because there were no plugs to touch. Everything ran wirelessly through the system I'd built, the system that was currently deciding it didn't feel like cooperating anymore. You could have heard a pin drop in that ballroom. 300 people collectively held their breath, watching those blank screens like they were waiting for a miracle or a disaster, unable to tell which one was coming. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely, their instruments frozen mid-note, the cellist's bow hovering above her strings as she watched the chaos unfold with the fascinated detachment of someone who was getting paid either way. Tyler reappeared, practically sprinting this time, his tablet screen illuminated with what I knew, because I designed the error messages myself, was a very specific, very deliberate notification. He thrust it at Eric, pointing at something on the display, his voice rising above whisper level into the range of barely controlled panic. "Sir, something's wrong with the system," Tyler said, stating the obvious with the kind of helpful clarity that people resort to when their brain is short-circuiting. "We can't access the main servers. The backup authentication isn't working. It's like everything's locked." Eric finally tore his attention away from me to look at the tablet, his face transitioning from angry red to confused pale in about 3 seconds flat. I watched his eyes scan the screen, watched the exact moment he started to understand that this wasn't just a technical glitch or bad timing or the universe conspiring against his perfect evening. This was deliberate. This was personal. This was me. "What's happening?" Serena stammered from her position near the stage, her voice losing that confident edge she'd been carrying all night. replaced by something that almost sounded like fear. She looked at Eric, then at Tyler, then finally at me, and I saw the calculation happening behind her eyes, the pieces slowly clicking into place. I shrugged. The gesture made slightly awkward by the fact that two security guards were still holding my arms, though their grip had loosened considerably as they too tried to figure out what the hell was going on. "Looks like the system doesn't recognize you anymore," I said, keeping my voice conversational, like we were discussing the weather or traffic patterns instead of the complete meltdown of a multi-million-dollar company's infrastructure. "Fix it now," Eric shouted at Tyler, his voice cracking slightly on the last word, authority giving way to desperation. But Tyler just stood there, shaking his head, looking at his tablet like it had personally betrayed him. I chuckled, the sound low and genuinely amused. "Can't fix it, Eric. See, here's the thing about systems. They need their primary administrator to function properly. And you just tried to throw him out of the building." That's when understanding finally dawned on Eric's face. That beautiful moment of realization when someone figures out they've made a catastrophic mistake, but it's way too late to fix it. Then it appeared, blazing across every single screen in the ballroom like the world's most expensive error message, rendered in that clinical, sans serif font that somehow made it look even more damning. Primary key missing. Not system error, or please wait, or any of the vague, reassuring messages that usually appear when technology hiccups. No, this was specific, technical, and for anyone who understood even basic database architecture, absolutely devastating. Every single screen. The massive displays behind the stage, the smaller monitors set up around the room for overflow viewing, even the digital sign by the entrance that had been cycling through the evening's agenda. All of them now showed the same message, pulsing gently like a heartbeat, like the system itself was announcing its own death. The CFO, Thomas something or other, a guy who'd probably never written a line of code in his life, but loved to talk about leveraging synergies and optimizing workflows, dropped his martini glass. Tablets came out. Phones were frantically unlocked, and I could see them forming an impromptu crisis huddle, their voices rising in that particular pitch that technical people use when something has gone catastrophically wrong, and they're trying to figure out whose fault it is before management does. Tyler was typing so fast on his tablet, I thought his fingers might catch fire, his face illuminated by the screen's glow as he pulled up diagnostics and system logs and probably every troubleshooting guide he'd ever bookmarked. Next to him, Sarah from cybersecurity, a woman I'd actually respected back when I worked there because she was one of the few people who'd actually understood what I was building, had gone completely white, her expression suggesting she'd just realized the magnitude of what they were dealing with. "This isn't possible," she muttered, loud enough for people around her to hear. "The backup systems should have kicked in. The redundancies should have prevented this. Unless..." She trailed off, her eyes widening as she looked up from her device and locked eyes with me across the room. She knew. Of all the people in this building, Sarah was probably the only one besides me who understood exactly what primary key missing meant, and more importantly, what it meant that no backup was working. Someone in the crowd, one of the investors based on his expensive watch and the way he carried himself like money was his first language, shouted, "What does that mean? What's a primary key?" His companion, a woman in a red dress who'd been laughing at Eric's jokes 5 minutes ago, tried to explain. "It's like the master password? The main access point." She looked around for confirmation, but the tech team was too busy having coordinated mental breakdowns to educate the masses on database architecture. Another investor, this older gentleman who I recognized from the board meetings I used to sit in on back when they pretended to value my input, pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my broker," he announced to no one in particular. "If their systems are down, their stock is going to tank tomorrow." That started a chain reaction. Suddenly, everyone with Nexus Data Labs stock, which was most of the room, considering they'd gone public 8 months ago in an IPO that had been called the tech success story of the year by several financial publications, was pulling out their phones, making calls, sending texts, probably triggering sell orders before the news hit the wider market. The soft glow of phone screens illuminated the ballroom like a constellation of tiny warnings that the ship was sinking and the rats were already swimming for shore. Janet from HR, the same Janet who'd sent me that "thank you for your service" email without a trace of actual gratitude, was trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Everyone please remain calm," she called out in that practiced HR voice that's supposed to be soothing, but just makes everyone more anxious. "I'm sure this is just a minor technical difficulty." But even she didn't sound convinced, and the way she kept glancing at Eric with increasing panic suggested she was already mentally updating her own resume. Near the hors d'oeuvres table, which was now completely abandoned because apparently caviar loses its appeal when your company is imploding, Richard from sales was having a very animated conversation on his phone. "No, don't sign the contract yet," he was saying, his voice carrying across the room. "Just wait until tomorrow. Something's come up." The something in question being the complete and total failure of the infrastructure that made their entire business model possible. But sure, Richard, undersell it a little more. Amanda, the junior developer I trained, finally worked up the courage to approach the security guards who were still technically holding me, though at this point it was more like we were all standing together watching the same disaster movie. She said hesitantly, looking at me with an expression that mixed guilt, understanding, and what might have been a tiny bit of admiration. Is this my fault?" I finished for her, smiling. "No, Amanda, this is their fault. I just stopped preventing the inevitable." She nodded slowly, like she was processing something she'd suspected but never confirmed, then backed away to rejoin her panicking colleagues. At least she'd had the decency to acknowledge me, which was more than most of them had done when they'd escorted me out 3 months ago. The string quartet, bless them, tried to resume playing, some light classical number that was probably meant to calm everyone down, but gave up after about 30 seconds when it became clear that nobody was listening and the vibe had shifted from elegant corporate celebration to Titanic after it hit the iceberg. Eric's face had transitioned through several colors in rapid succession: red, pale, purple, and now settling on a kind of grayish tone that suggested his blood pressure was doing things blood pressure definitely shouldn't do. He was barking orders at Tyler and the tech team, but they were all talking over each other, a cacophony of technical jargon and increasingly desperate suggestions. "Reboot everything. We can't. We don't have admin access. What about the cloud backup?" "The cloud backup requires authentication from the primary server, which is locked," Sarah finished, her voice flat with the resignation of someone who'd just realized they were completely, utterly screwed. Serena stood frozen near the stage, her silver dress now looking less like a fashion statement and more like a costume for a play that had gone horribly wrong. She was staring at the screens with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly, but also something else. Recognition, maybe. The slow dawning understanding that the quiet guy in the background, the one she'd helped push out, the one whose work she'd built her reputation on, had just proven exactly how essential he'd been all along. The buzzcut security guard finally let go of my arm completely. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think maybe we should let him stay." His partner nodded in agreement. "Yeah, something tells me he's not the problem here." I appreciated their evolving understanding of the situation. It restored a little bit of my faith in humanity, or at least in security guards who were smarter than the people paying them. Miguel, still behind the bar because apparently bartenders stay at their posts no matter what kind of chaos unfolds, caught my eye and gave me a slight nod of respect. He'd seen a lot of things in his career, but this was probably going to be a story he told at other gigs for years. The time I watched a guy single-handedly destroy a tech company with an error message. Someone from accounting, I think her name was Patricia, actually started crying. "My stock options," she sobbed to her colleague. "I was going to buy a house." Her colleague, trying to be comforting but clearly panicking himself, patted her shoulder. "Maybe it's temporary. Maybe they can fix it." But they couldn't fix it. That was the beautiful, terrifying, absolutely perfect part. Every person in that tech team knew it, even if they weren't ready to admit it yet. You can't fix a system that's been locked by the person who built it, not without his cooperation, not without the credentials and access that only he possessed. They could try to rebuild from scratch, sure, but that would take months, maybe years, and in the meantime, every transaction, every client interaction, every piece of data that Nexus Data Labs needed to function, all of it was trapped behind a door that only I had the key to. Eric finally turned back to me, his expression a mixture of rage and something that might have been desperation if he'd been humble enough to feel desperate. Our eyes met across the ballroom, across the wreckage of his perfect evening, across the smoking ruins of the empire he thought he'd built. "You," he said, the single word carrying more venom than I'd thought possible. "You did this." I raised my glass of sparkling water in a mock toast, smiled my best smile, the one I usually reserve for ironic situations and karmic justice. "No, Eric, you did this. I just stopped cleaning up your mess." And that's when the real panic began. Panic spread through that ballroom like wildfire through a drought-stricken forest, fast and merciless and absolutely unstoppable. What had started as confused murmuring escalated into full-blown chaos in about 30 seconds flat, which honestly might be a record for corporate meltdown speed. I should check the Guinness Book for that one. The phones started ringing first, not the cell phones that everyone was already clutching like lifelines, but the actual business lines that people apparently still carried because they thought it made them look important. The sound was cacophonous, a symphony of different ringtones, all competing for attention, each one probably bringing worse news than the last. I watched as face after face went pale, as voices rose in pitch and urgency, as the reality of what was happening spread from person to person like the world's worst game of telephone. "The payment portal is down," someone shouted from near the entrance, a guy in a gray suit who I vaguely recognized as being from the finance department. He had his phone pressed so hard against his ear I thought he might accidentally merge with it. "Clients can't process transactions. They're calling the emergency line and nobody can help them because we can't access the system." That was met with another wave of panic. See, Nexus Data Labs wasn't just some random tech company playing with apps and social media algorithms. They processed actual financial transactions for actual clients who moved actual money. Lots of it. When your entire business model depends on being able to facilitate secure data transfers, and your system suddenly decides to take an unscheduled vacation, that's not just embarrassing. That's the kind of thing that gets you sued, investigated, and potentially shut down by multiple regulatory agencies who are very interested in why you can't protect your client's data. Near the stage, Tyler had been joined by what looked like the entire IT department, all of them crowded around tablets and laptops that had been hastily set up on a table meant for champagne flutes. Their faces were illuminated by screen glow, making them look like characters in a horror movie, which honestly wasn't that far from the truth. They were typing frantically, pulling up command prompts and diagnostic tools, probably running through every troubleshooting protocol they'd ever learned in their computer science degrees and finding absolutely nothing that worked. "Try the secondary authentication," one of them shouted. I think it was Marcus, the guy who'd originally gotten me this gig back when we were friends, and he didn't realize he was hiring the instrument of his company's destruction. "Already did," Tyler shot back, his voice cracking with stress. "It requires administrator approval, which requires credentials we don't have," Sarah finished, slamming her laptop shut with enough force that several people nearby flinched. She ran her hands through her hair, destroying the professional styling she'd probably spent an hour on this morning. "This is insane. Every single failsafe, every backup protocol, every redundancy system, they all route back to the primary administrator access. And we don't have it. We never actually had it." The implications of that statement rippled through the tech team like a shockwave. They all turned, almost in unison, to look at Eric, who was still standing near the stage looking like he'd been personally betrayed by the concept of technology itself. His expensive suit was rumpled now, his perfectly styled hair had been run through with anxious fingers enough times that it stuck up in weird angles, and there was a visible sweat stain spreading under his arms that his designer fabric was doing its best but failing to hide. "What do you mean we never had it?" Eric demanded, his voice hitting that dangerous pitch that powerful men use when they're about to fire someone and want everyone to know they're very serious and very angry about being made to look stupid. Sarah actually laughed, a sharp, slightly hysterical sound. "I mean exactly what I said, Eric. The administrator access you thought you had? It was provisional, limited. It only worked because the actual administrator." She pointed directly at me, and suddenly every eye in the room followed her finger like I was the star witness in a murder trial. "Allowed it to work. He built in master overrides that superseded everything. And now that he's revoked that access, we're locked out of our own system. You could have heard a pin drop. Actually, you could have heard a feather drop. Hell, You could have heard someone thinking about dropping something and deciding against it. One of the younger engineers, a kid fresh out of MIT, who probably still had his graduation tassel hanging from his rearview mirror, stood up so fast his chair fell backwards. The backup. He practically shouted, like he'd just solved world hunger and cured cancer simultaneously. We have comprehensive backups. We can restore from those and rebuild the access. For about 3 seconds, hope flickered across the faces of everyone from Nexus Data Labs. Eric actually straightened up, his expression shifting from defeated to cautiously optimistic. Serena, still frozen in her silver dress like a very expensive statue, took a step forward. Even some of the investors stopped their panicked phone calls to listen. Then Sarah, bless her technical accuracy and inability to sugarcoat reality, shook her head. The backups are encrypted, she said flatly. They require authentication from the primary server to decrypt, which requires administrator access. The MIT kid finished, his face falling as the brief spark of hope extinguished like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water on it. He picked up his chair and sat back down with the defeated slump of someone who'd just realized they were completely and utterly screwed. The backup is useless without the original administrator, Tyler yelled, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the kind of clarity that usually requires a microphone. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, more like he was yelling at the universe itself, at the fundamental unfairness of a situation where they'd built their entire company on someone else's foundation and then acted surprised when they couldn't operate without him. The phrase echoed across the room, bouncing off those marble walls and crystal chandeliers, settling into the consciousness of every person who'd ever taken credit for work they didn't do or pushed out someone they thought was expendable. The backup is nothing without the original. It was almost poetic, really. A metaphor so perfect it could have been a bumper sticker or one of those motivational posters that tech companies love to hang in their break rooms. Except this one was less about inspiration and more about karmic justice served cold. Serena's face turned ghost white, every trace of color draining from her complexion until she looked like she might actually pass out. She grabbed the edge of the stage for support, her knuckles going white with the pressure. Her eyes found mine across the room, and for the first time since I'd walked through those doors tonight, I saw something that wasn't contempt or indifference. I saw fear. Raw, genuine, oh God, what have I done fear. Eric had started sweating profusely now, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of panic in a combination that probably violated several Geneva Convention protocols. He pulled out his phone, hands shaking slightly as he tried to dial someone. Probably his lawyer, maybe his PR team, possibly a priest, because at this point divine intervention might be his best option. But before he could complete the call, his phone rang first. The look on his face when he saw the caller ID suggested it was not good news. Hello, he answered, his voice trying for authoritative and landing somewhere around desperate. Yes, this is Eric Langford. What? No, we're experiencing a temporary. He was cut off by whoever was on the other end, and I watched his face cycle through several more shades of panic. I understand that, but another interruption. We're working on it right now, I assure you. More talking from the other end that I couldn't hear, but could definitely interpret based on Eric's increasingly frantic expression. 24 hours? We can't possibly. The person on the other end apparently didn't care what he could or couldn't do, because Eric's shoulders sagged in defeat. Yes, I understand. We'll do everything we can. He hung up and looked around at the assembled chaos like a captain watching his ship sink. That was the Thornton Group, he said to no one and everyone simultaneously. They're threatening to pull their contract if we don't have systems operational within 24 hours. That's 40% of our revenue. The ballroom erupted into fresh chaos. 40% of revenue disappearing would tank the company faster than you could say bankruptcy filing. More phones came out, more panicked conversations began. More people started doing the mental math on how quickly they could find new jobs before this mess hit their resumes. I remained exactly where I was, leaning against the bar with my sparkling water, watching the dominoes continue to fall in exactly the pattern I predicted they would. Miguel the bartender was watching too, occasionally shaking his head with the weary understanding of someone who'd served drinks at enough corporate events to know that karma was real and she was savage. You know, I said, loud enough for the people near me to hear, my voice cutting through the chaos with casual observation. Maybe next time you should back up your morals before your data. Might have saved you some trouble. There was a beat of stunned silence, and then something unexpected happened. People actually laughed. Not everyone. Eric certainly didn't, and Serena looked like she might throw up, but enough people that it carried across the room. Quiet laughter, uncomfortable laughter, the kind that escapes when a situation is so absurd and terrible that your brain doesn't know how else to process it. Some of it was definitely nervous energy, but some of it, I think, was genuine appreciation for the poetry of the moment. Even a few of the Nexus employees cracked smiles, quickly hidden, but definitely there. Turns out when you treat people like disposable resources, they're not super upset when karma catches up with management. I raised my glass of sparkling water. To the room, to the chaos, to the beautiful catastrophe unfolding before me like a symphony I'd composed but never had to play. To poetic justice, I announced. May she always remember the people who forgot to read the fine print. Several people actually clinked their glasses with mine as I held it up, including one of the investors who apparently had a sense of humor about losing money, or maybe just appreciated a well-executed revenge plot when he saw one. The meltdown was complete. The system was down. The company was crumbling. And for the first time in months, I felt absolutely, perfectly at peace. Was making my way toward the exit, because honestly there was nothing left to see here except grown adults having coordinated panic attacks, when Eric materialized in front of me like a very angry, very sweaty ghost. He must have pushed through about 30 people to get to me that fast, leaving a wake of startled guests and probably a few spilled drinks. His face was inches from mine, close enough that I could smell the desperation mixed with whatever expensive aftershave he'd doused himself in this morning when he thought tonight was going to be his triumphant celebration. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous, like he thought intimidation would somehow work on the guy who'd just brought his entire company to its knees with a few lines of code. "What the hell did you do to my system?" I actually smiled at that. Couldn't help it. "Your system?" I repeated, letting the words hang in the air between us like a challenge. "That's interesting. See, I didn't do anything, Eric. I really didn't. You just removed the wrong guy." His jaw clenched so hard I thought he might crack a molar, and honestly that would have been icing on the cake at this point. "Don't play games with me," he hissed. "This is sabotage. This is illegal. I'll have you arrested for." "For what?" I interrupted, keeping my voice calm and reasonable, which I could tell was pissing him off even more than if I'd been yelling. "For revoking my own administrator access to a system I built? For protecting intellectual property that belongs to me? Go ahead, call the cops. I'll wait." I made a show of checking my watch. "Should I call them for you? I've got nothing but time now that I'm unemployed and all." "The system belongs to the company," Eric shouted, loud enough that several conversations around us stopped as people turned to watch this confrontation unfold. His face had gone that deep purple color again, the one that suggested his blood pressure was doing things his doctor would definitely not approve of. "You were paid to develop it. That makes it company property." I reached into my jacket pocket, moving slowly because the security guards were still hovering nearby, and I didn't want them getting jumpy, and pulled out my phone. A few swipes, and I had what I needed. The document I'd been carrying around like a lucky charm for the past 3 months. The one piece of leverage I'd known would eventually become relevant. "Actually," I said, turning the phone so he could see the screen, "that's not quite how it works." On the display was the original startup contract, the one I'd signed back when Nexus Data Labs was just a struggling company desperate for someone to build them something that wouldn't fall apart. I'd been young and naive, but not stupid enough to sign away all my rights, so I'd included a clause, buried in the legal jargon where most people don't bother to read, that specified intellectual property ownership would be shared, with the creator maintaining primary administrative rights. "See this?" I pointed at the relevant paragraph, highlighted in yellow for easy reference. "This says that the infrastructure belongs to its creator." That would be me. And this part here. I scrolled down, pointing to another section. "This says primary administrative access cannot be transferred without written consent of the creator." Guess who signed it first? Guess who never gave written consent to transfer that access? Eric's face drained of color faster than water down a drain, going from angry purple to corpse pale in about 2 seconds. His eyes scanned the document, his lips moving slightly as he read. and I watched in real time as he realized just how badly his legal team had screwed up. Or maybe they hadn't screwed up at all. Maybe he'd just never bothered to read the fine print, too confident in his own importance to think that a contract with some freelance developer would ever come back to bite him. "This can't be legal," he stammered, but his voice had lost all its conviction. "Our lawyers would have caught this." "They would have." "Would have what?" I asked. "Actually read the contract?" "Yeah, that would have been smart. But see, your lawyers were probably more focused on protecting the company from external threats. They never imagined the threat would come from the guy you thought was too insignificant to matter." Behind Eric, I could see Serena pushing through the crowd, her silver dress catching the light as she moved with the kind of urgency that suggested she'd finally understood the magnitude of what was happening. She reached us just as Eric was opening his mouth to respond, probably to threaten me with more legal action that wouldn't go anywhere, and she did something I hadn't expected. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my jacket sleeve, her face a mask of desperation that I'd never seen before. The Ice Queen had melted, and what was left was someone who'd just realized her entire carefully constructed career was built on a foundation that was actively crumbling beneath her feet. "Can't you fix this?" she whispered, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the chaos in the ballroom. "Please, please fix it. We can work something out. We can talk about this." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then up at her face, and something inside me that used to love her, that used to believe we were partners, that used to think she was worth building a life with, felt absolutely nothing. Just a hollow space where affection used to live. "Funny," I said, gently removing her hand from my arm like I was peeling off a piece of tape. "That's the first time you've said please since our wedding." "Actually, no. You said please when you wanted me to cover for you with your mother about that business trip to San Francisco. The one where you stayed at the Four Seasons with Eric." I saw her flinch at that, saw the confirmation in her eyes even though she didn't say anything. "But please fix your career? Please save the reputation you built on my work?" "That's a new one." "I never meant," she started, but I was already turning away, already walking toward those glass doors that led out of this glittering nightmare and into the cool night air that suddenly seemed a lot more appealing than anything inside this building. Eric's voice rose behind me, sharp with panic. "You can't just leave. We need to fix this. Name your price. Anything. Just name it." I paused at the doors, looked back at the scene I was leaving behind, the chaos, the panic, the important people who suddenly weren't so important anymore, and smiled. "My price is watching you realize that some people aren't for sale, Eric. Some people actually meant it when they said marriage vows. Some people don't build their success by stepping on everyone who helped them. And some people remember who their friends were before they got too important to return phone calls." I pushed through the doors while Eric screamed into his phone like it was a lifeline, his voice echoing across the marble and crystal and expensive devastation. But it wasn't a lifeline. It was just another piece of technology that couldn't save him from the consequences of his own actions. Not anymore. As I reached those massive glass doors, something unexpected happened. Something that I definitely hadn't planned for, but was going to replay in my head for years to come like the world's most satisfying movie scene. Applause broke out behind me. Actual, genuine, sustained applause that started somewhere near the back of the ballroom and rippled forward like a wave, building in volume until it filled the entire space with the kind of sound usually reserved for rock concerts and standing ovations. Not for Eric, not for Serena, not for the company that was currently experiencing a meltdown of biblical proportions. For me, for the guy who'd been escorted out of meetings, dismissed as background noise, and treated like his contributions were as forgettable as yesterday's weather forecast. I stopped with my hand on the door handle, turned around, and just soaked it in. 300 employees who had watched me get humiliated, who'd seen me built up just enough to be torn down, who'd witnessed Serena parade around with Eric while I became the office ghost story that people didn't talk about in polite company. They were all clapping. Some of them were even standing, their champagne flutes forgotten on tables and trays, their faces showing expressions that ranged from respect to barely suppressed glee. The buzzcut security guard who'd tried to escort me out earlier was clapping too, a huge grin on his face. His partner had his hands cupped around his mouth and actually shouted, "Hell yeah," which probably violated about 17 company policies, but who was going to enforce those now? Janet from HR? She was too busy having an existential crisis near the stage. Amanda, the junior developer I'd trained, was clapping so hard her hands had to hurt. Next to her, Marcus, my old college buddy who'd gotten me into this mess in the first place, gave me a salute that was part respect, part apology, and entirely deserved. Even some of the investors were clapping, including the older gentleman who'd threatened to call his broker earlier. He raised his glass to me with a nod that suggested he appreciated a well-executed power play when he saw one, even if it was costing him money. Miguel the bartender was doing the slow clap, the kind you see in movies when someone's about to give an inspiring speech, except this wasn't a movie and there was no speech. Just me, standing in a doorway, watching the people who'd forgotten I existed suddenly remember exactly how much they'd needed me all along. Even the DJ looked impressed, and this was a guy who probably spun at corporate events 3 times a week and thought he'd seen everything. He actually stopped the ambient music he'd been playing, because apparently he'd kept working through the entire system meltdown like the professional he was, and the sudden silence made the applause even more dramatic. His playlist had nothing on my timing, and from the look on his face, he knew it. Eric wasn't clapping. He was standing near the stage with his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly with his free hand, while presumably getting screamed at by another client or investor, or possibly his mother, who would definitely be disappointed in how this evening had turned out. Serena wasn't clapping either. She'd sunk into one of those ridiculously expensive chairs they'd rented for the event, her silver dress pooling around her like liquid mercury, her face buried in her hands in a pose that would have made a great album cover for a country song about regret and poor life choices. Tyler and the tech team weren't clapping because they were too busy frantically typing on their laptops, probably trying to find some miraculous workaround that didn't exist, but a few of them looked up long enough to give me nods of acknowledgement. Sarah actually stopped what she was doing to give me a full standing ovation, and I appreciated that. She'd always been one of the good ones, someone who understood that systems were built by people, not manifested out of thin air by CEO charisma and quarterly earnings reports. I gave the room a small bow. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to acknowledge that yes, I was aware of the applause, and yes, I was absolutely savoring every second of it. Then I pushed through those doors and stepped out into the night, leaving behind the crystal chandeliers and marble floors and the sound of 300 people who just learned a very valuable lesson about reading contracts and treating people like human beings instead of disposable resources. Outside, the night air felt different. Lighter. Honest. The kind of air that doesn't lie to you about late-night meetings or team dinners or business trips to San Francisco. The October breeze carried the smell of the city, exhaust fumes, street food from the vendors that set up on the corner, that indefinable scent that big cities have that's somehow both grimy and alive. And it was infinitely more appealing than the expensive catering and fake politeness I'd just left behind. The valet parking attendant, a young guy who probably made minimum wage to stand outside in the cold and fetch cars for people who thought tipping was optional, watched me emerge from the gala with wide eyes. Sir? Do you need your car?" he asked hesitantly, probably wondering if I was about to cause a scene in his section of the world too. "Yeah," I said, handing him my ticket. "And you might want to stay out here for the next hour or so. It's about to get real messy in there." He glanced at the glass doors, through which you could still see the chaos unfolding in the ballroom, and nodded slowly. "Worse than it already is?" "So much worse," I confirmed, and slipped him a 20 because he'd been polite and seemed like a decent kid who deserved a heads up about the exodus that was probably going to happen when people started fleeing this disaster like rats from a sinking ship. My phone, which I'd silenced during the festivities because I'd wanted to enjoy the show without distractions, suddenly started buzzing like it was having a seizure. Notifications poured in so fast the screen couldn't keep up. Texts, emails, LinkedIn messages, even a couple of voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. I pulled it out and started scrolling through the chaos. Job offers. Holy shit, the job offers. At least 10 of them already. From companies ranging from startups to massive tech corporations. All of them apparently having heard through the industry grapevine about what had just gone down at the Grandview Hotel. News traveled fast in Silicon Valley, and news about a developer taking down an entire company by revoking his own access traveled at light speed. Saw what happened at Nexus. Very interested in discussing opportunities. Name your price. That was from TechCore, a company I'd interviewed with last year before deciding to go with Nexus because Serena had been so excited about us working in the same building. We need someone who actually understands system security. Are you available? DataBridge Industries, offering a six-figure salary right there in the text message like they were afraid someone else would snap me up first. Partnership deals, consulting offers, even a message from a venture capitalist who wanted to fund whatever I wanted to build next, because apparently publicly destroying your former employer's infrastructure was the new way to prove you were worth investing in. The tech industry was weird, but I wasn't complaining. And then, buried in the avalanche of professional opportunities and congratulations from people I barely knew, there was one text from Serena. Just 4 words. We need to talk. I stared at it for a long moment, standing there on the sidewalk while the valet went to get my car, the sounds of the city humming around me like a soundtrack to my newfound freedom. We need to talk. The classic phrase of someone who'd realized they'd screwed up, but wasn't quite ready to admit it out loud. The opening line of a conversation that would probably involve apologies and excuses and justifications for why she'd done what she'd done, all wrapped up in the kind of emotional manipulation that people use when they want you to forget they'd stabbed you in the back. I could have responded with a lot of things. I could have written a long message about trust and betrayal and how she'd taken the foundation we built together and used it to elevate herself while pushing me down. I could have told her exactly how many nights I'd spent lying awake wondering what I'd done wrong, what I could have done differently, how I could have been better, before finally realizing that none of it was my fault and all of it was her choice. Instead, I opened my photos, found the screenshot I'd taken earlier of those massive screens displaying their error message, and sent it to her without any commentary. Just the image, primary key missing, rendered in that cold, clinical font against a black background. Some metaphors write themselves, and this one didn't need any explanation. The backup was nothing without the original. The system didn't work without its creator. The foundation crumbles when you remove the person who built it, and then act surprised when everything falls apart. 3 dots appeared immediately, showing she was typing a response. Then they disappeared, then appeared again, then disappeared again. Whatever she was trying to say, she couldn't find the words, and honestly that was probably the most honest communication we'd had in months. My car arrived, the valet hopping out and holding the door open with a knowing smile that suggested he'd figured out I was somehow responsible for whatever disaster was unfolding inside. I tipped him another 20, slid into the driver's seat, and took one last look at the Grandview Hotel, at the glass doors and marble facade, and all that expensive architecture that housed expensive people having expensive problems. Then I drove away, leaving behind the wreckage of their success story and the ruins of my marriage, heading toward whatever came next with a phone full of opportunities and a heart that was finally starting to feel lighter than it had in months. Exit, stage left. The show was over, and I'd gotten my standing ovation. As I reached those massive glass doors, something unexpected happened. Something that I definitely hadn't planned for, but was going to replay in my head for years to come like the world's most satisfying movie scene. Applause broke out behind me. Actual, genuine, sustained applause that started somewhere near the back of the ballroom and rippled forward like a wave, building in volume until it filled the entire space with the kind of sound usually reserved for rock concerts and standing ovations. Not for Eric. Not for Serena. Not for the company that was currently experiencing a meltdown of biblical proportions. For me. For the guy who'd been escorted out of meetings, dismissed as background noise, and treated like his contributions were as forgettable as yesterday's weather forecast. I stopped with my hand on the door handle, turned around, and just soaked it in. 300 employees who had watched me get humiliated, who'd seen me built up just enough to be torn down, who'd witnessed Serena parade around with Eric while I became the office ghost story that people didn't talk about in polite company. They were all clapping. Some of them were even standing, their champagne flutes forgotten on tables and trays, their faces showing expressions that ranged from respect to barely suppressed glee. The buzzcut security guard who'd tried to escort me out earlier was clapping too, a huge grin on his face. His partner had his hands cupped around his mouth and actually shouted, "Hell yeah," which probably violated about 17 company policies, but who was going to enforce those now? Janet from HR? She was too busy having an existential crisis near the stage. Amanda, the junior developer I'd trained, was clapping so hard her hands had to hurt. Next to her, Marcus, my old college buddy who'd gotten me into this mess in the first place, gave me a salute that was part respect, part apology, and entirely deserved. Even some of the investors were clapping, including the older gentleman who'd threatened to call his broker earlier. He raised his glass to me with a nod that suggested he appreciated a well-executed power play when he saw one, even if it was costing him money. Miguel the bartender was doing the slow clap, the kind you see in movies when someone's about to give an inspiring speech, except this wasn't a movie and there was no speech. Just me, standing in a doorway, watching the people who'd forgotten I existed suddenly remember exactly how much they'd needed me all along. Even the DJ looked impressed, and this was a guy who probably spun at corporate events 3 times a week and thought he'd seen everything. He actually stopped the ambient music he'd been playing, because apparently he'd kept working through the entire system meltdown like the professional he was, and the sudden silence made the applause even more dramatic. His playlist had nothing on my timing, and from the look on his face, he knew it. Eric wasn't clapping. He was standing near the stage with his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly with his free hand, while presumably getting screamed at by another client or investor, or possibly his mother, who would definitely be disappointed in how this evening had turned out. Serena wasn't clapping either. She'd sunk into one of those ridiculously expensive chairs they'd rented for the event, her silver dress pooling around her like liquid mercury, her face buried in her hands in a pose that would have made a great album cover for a country song about regret and poor life choices. Tyler and the tech team weren't clapping because they were too busy frantically typing on their laptops, probably trying to find some miraculous workaround that didn't exist, but a few of them looked up long enough to give me nods of acknowledgement. Sarah actually stopped what she was doing to give me a full standing ovation, and I appreciated that. She'd always been one of the good ones, someone who understood that systems were built by people, not manifested out of thin air by CEO charisma and quarterly earnings reports. I gave the room a small bow, nothing too dramatic, just enough to acknowledge that yes, I was aware of the applause, and yes, I was absolutely savoring every second of it. Then I pushed through those doors and stepped out into the night, leaving behind the crystal chandeliers and marble floors and the sound of 300 people who just learned a very valuable lesson about reading contracts and treating people like human beings instead of disposable resources. Outside, the night air felt different. Lighter, honest, the kind of air that doesn't lie to you about late-night meetings or team dinners or business trips to San Francisco. The October breeze carried the smell of the city, exhaust fumes, street food from the vendors that set up on the corner, that indefinable scent that big cities have that's somehow both grimy and alive. And it was infinitely more appealing than the expensive catering and fake politeness I'd just left behind. The valet parking attendant, a young guy who probably made minimum wage to stand outside in the cold and fetch cars for people who thought tipping was optional, watched me emerge from the gala with wide eyes. Sir? Do you need your car?" he asked hesitantly, probably wondering if I was about to cause a scene in his section of the world too. "Yeah," I said, handing him my ticket. "And you might want to stay out here for the next hour or so. It's about to get real messy in there." He glanced at the glass doors, through which you could still see the chaos unfolding in the ballroom, and nodded slowly. "Worse than it already is?" "So much worse," I confirmed, and slipped him a 20 because he'd been polite and seemed like a decent kid who deserved a heads up about the exodus that was probably going to happen when people started fleeing this disaster like rats from a sinking ship. My phone, which I'd silenced during the festivities because I'd wanted to enjoy the show without distractions, suddenly started buzzing like it was having a seizure. Notifications poured in so fast the screen couldn't keep up. Texts, emails, LinkedIn messages, even a couple of voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. I pulled it out and started scrolling through the chaos. Job offers. Holy shit, the job offers. At least 10 of them already. From companies ranging from startups to massive tech corporations. All of them apparently having heard through the industry grapevine about what had just gone down at the Grandview Hotel. News traveled fast in Silicon Valley, and news about a developer taking down an entire company by revoking his own access traveled at light speed. Saw what happened at Nexus. Very interested in discussing opportunities. Name your price. That was from TechCore, a company I'd interviewed with last year before deciding to go with Nexus because Serena had been so excited about us working in the same building. We need someone who actually understands system security. Are you available? DataBridge Industries, offering a six-figure salary right there in the text message like they were afraid someone else would snap me up first. Partnership deals, consulting offers, even a message from a venture capitalist who wanted to fund whatever I wanted to build next, because apparently publicly destroying your former employer's infrastructure was the new way to prove you were worth investing in. The tech industry was weird, but I wasn't complaining. And then, buried in the avalanche of professional opportunities and congratulations from people I barely knew, there was one text from Serena. Just 4 words. We need to talk. I stared at it for a long moment, standing there on the sidewalk while the valet went to get my car, the sounds of the city humming around me like a soundtrack to my newfound freedom. We need to talk. The classic phrase of someone who'd realized they'd screwed up, but wasn't quite ready to admit it out loud. The opening line of a conversation that would probably involve apologies and excuses and justifications for why she'd done what she'd done, all wrapped up in the kind of emotional manipulation that people use when they want you to forget they'd stabbed you in the back. I could have responded with a lot of things. I could have written a long message about trust and betrayal and how she'd taken the foundation we built together and used it to elevate herself while pushing me down. I could have told her exactly how many nights I'd spent lying awake wondering what I'd done wrong, what I could have done differently, how I could have been better, before finally realizing that none of it was my fault and all of it was her choice. Instead, I opened my photos, found the screenshot I'd taken earlier of those massive screens displaying their error message, and sent it to her without any commentary. Just the image, primary key missing, rendered in that cold, clinical font against a black background. Some metaphors write themselves, and this one didn't need any explanation. The backup was nothing without the original. The system didn't work without its creator. The foundation crumbles when you remove the person who built it, and then act surprised when everything falls apart. 3 dots appeared immediately, showing she was typing a response. Then they disappeared, then appeared again, then disappeared again. Whatever she was trying to say, she couldn't find the words. And honestly, that was probably the most honest communication we'd had in months. My car arrived, the valet hopping out and holding the door open with a knowing smile that suggested he'd figured out I was somehow responsible for whatever disaster was unfolding inside. I tipped him another 20, slid into the driver's seat, and took one last look at the Grandview Hotel, at the glass doors and marble facade, and all that expensive architecture that housed expensive people having expensive problems. Then I drove away, leaving behind the wreckage of their success story and the ruins of my marriage, heading toward whatever came next with a phone full of opportunities and a heart that was finally starting to feel lighter than it had in months. Exit, stage left. The show was over, and I'd gotten my standing ovation. As I reached those massive glass doors, something unexpected happened. Something that I definitely hadn't planned for, but was going to replay in my head for years to come like the world's most satisfying movie scene. Applause broke out behind me. Actual, genuine, sustained applause that started somewhere near the back of the ballroom and rippled forward like a wave, building in volume until it filled the entire space with the kind of sound usually reserved for rock concerts and standing ovations. Not for Eric. Not for Serena. Not for the company that was currently experiencing a meltdown of biblical proportions. For me. For the guy who'd been escorted out of meetings, dismissed as background noise, and treated like his contributions were as forgettable as yesterday's weather forecast. I stopped with my hand on the door handle, turned around, and just soaked it in. 300 employees who had watched me get humiliated, who'd seen me built up just enough to be torn down, who'd witnessed Serena parade around with Eric while I became the office ghost story that people didn't talk about in polite company. They were all clapping. Some of them were even standing, their champagne flutes forgotten on tables and trays, their faces showing expressions that ranged from respect to barely suppressed glee. The buzzcut security guard who'd tried to escort me out earlier was clapping too, a huge grin on his face. His partner had his hands cupped around his mouth and actually shouted, "Hell yeah," which probably violated about 17 company policies, but who was going to enforce those now? Janet from HR? She was too busy having an existential crisis near the stage. Amanda, the junior developer I trained, was clapping so hard her hands had to hurt. Next to her, Marcus, my old college buddy who'd gotten me into this mess in the first place, gave me a salute that was part respect, part apology, and entirely deserved. Even some of the investors were clapping, including the older gentleman who'd threatened to call his broker earlier. He raised his glass to me with a nod that suggested he appreciated a well-executed power play when he saw one, even if it was costing him money. Miguel the bartender was doing the slow clap, the kind you see in movies when someone's about to give an inspiring speech, except this wasn't a movie and there was no speech. Just me, standing in a doorway, watching the people who'd forgotten I existed suddenly remember exactly how much they'd needed me all along. Even the DJ looked impressed, and this was a guy who probably spun at corporate events 3 times a week and thought he'd seen everything. He actually stopped the ambient music he'd been playing, because apparently he'd kept working through the entire system meltdown like the professional he was, and the sudden silence made the applause even more dramatic. His playlist had nothing on my timing, and from the look on his face, he knew it. Eric wasn't clapping. He was standing near the stage with his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly with his free hand, while presumably getting screamed at by another client or investor, or possibly his mother, who would definitely be disappointed in how this evening had turned out. Serena wasn't clapping either. She'd sunk into one of those ridiculously expensive chairs they'd rented for the event, her silver dress pooling around her like liquid mercury, her face buried in her hands in a pose that would have made a great album cover for a country song about regret and poor life choices. Tyler and the tech team weren't clapping because they were too busy frantically typing on their laptops, probably trying to find some miraculous workaround that didn't exist, but a few of them looked up long enough to give me nods of acknowledgement. Sarah actually stopped what she was doing to give me a full standing ovation, and I appreciated that. She'd always been one of the good ones, someone who understood that systems were built by people, not manifested out of thin air by CEO charisma and quarterly earnings reports. I gave the room a small bow, nothing too dramatic, just enough to acknowledge that yes, I was aware of the applause, and yes, I was absolutely savoring every second of it. Then I pushed through those doors and stepped out into the night, leaving behind the crystal chandeliers and marble floors and the sound of 300 people who just learned a very valuable lesson about reading contracts and treating people like human beings instead of disposable resources. Outside, the night air felt different. Lighter. Honest. The kind of air that doesn't lie to you about late-night meetings or team dinners or business trips to San Francisco. The October breeze carried the smell of the city, exhaust fumes, street food from the vendors that set up on the corner, that indefinable scent that big cities have that's somehow both grimy and alive. And it was infinitely more appealing than the expensive catering and fake politeness I'd just left behind. The valet parking attendant, a young guy who probably made minimum wage to stand outside in the cold and fetch cars for people who thought tipping was optional, watched me emerge from the gala with wide eyes. Sir? Do you need your car?" he asked hesitantly, probably wondering if I was about to cause a scene in his section of the world too. "Yeah," I said, handing him my ticket. "And you might want to stay out here for the next hour or so. It's about to get real messy in there." He glanced at the glass doors, through which you could still see the chaos unfolding in the ballroom, and nodded slowly. "Worse than it already is?" "So much worse," I confirmed, and slipped him a 20 because he'd been polite and seemed like a decent kid who deserved a heads up about the exodus that was probably going to happen when people started fleeing this disaster like rats from a sinking ship. My phone, which I'd silenced during the festivities because I'd wanted to enjoy the show without distractions, suddenly started buzzing like it was having a seizure. Notifications poured in so fast the screen couldn't keep up. Texts, emails, LinkedIn messages, even a couple of voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. I pulled it out and started scrolling through the chaos. Job offers. Holy shit, the job offers. At least 10 of them already. From companies ranging from startups to massive tech corporations. All of them apparently having heard through the industry grapevine about what had just gone down at the Grandview Hotel. News traveled fast in Silicon Valley, and news about a developer taking down an entire company by revoking his own access traveled at light speed. Saw what happened at Nexus. Very interested in discussing opportunities. Name your price. That was from TechCore, a company I'd interviewed with last year before deciding to go with Nexus because Serena had been so excited about us working in the same building. We need someone who actually understands system security. Are you available? DataBridge Industries, offering a six-figure salary right there in the text message like they were afraid someone else would snap me up first. Partnership deals, consulting offers, even a message from a venture capitalist who wanted to fund whatever I wanted to build next, because apparently publicly destroying your former employer's infrastructure was the new way to prove you were worth investing in. The tech industry was weird, but I wasn't complaining. And then, buried in the avalanche of professional opportunities and congratulations from people I barely knew, there was one text from Serena. Just 4 words. We need to talk. I stared at it for a long moment, standing there on the sidewalk while the valet went to get my car, the sounds of the city humming around me like a soundtrack to my newfound freedom. We need to talk. The classic phrase of someone who'd realized they'd screwed up, but wasn't quite ready to admit it out loud. The opening line of a conversation that would probably involve apologies and excuses and justifications for why she'd done what she'd done, all wrapped up in the kind of emotional manipulation that people use when they want you to forget they'd stabbed you in the back. I could have responded with a lot of things. I could have written a long message about trust and betrayal and how she'd taken the foundation we built together and used it to elevate herself while pushing me down. I could have told her exactly how many nights I'd spent lying awake wondering what I'd done wrong, what I could have done differently, how I could have been better, before finally realizing that none of it was my fault and all of it was her choice. Instead, I opened my photos, found the screenshot I'd taken earlier of those massive screens displaying their error message, and sent it to her without any commentary. Just the image, primary key missing, rendered in that cold, clinical font against a black background. Some metaphors write themselves, and this one didn't need any explanation. The backup was nothing without the original. The system didn't work without its creator. The foundation crumbles when you remove the person who built it, and then act surprised when everything falls apart. 3 dots appeared immediately, showing she was typing a response. Then they disappeared, then appeared again, then disappeared again. Whatever she was trying to say, she couldn't find the words, and honestly that was probably the most honest communication we'd had in months. My car arrived, the valet hopping out and holding the door open with a knowing smile that suggested he'd figured out I was somehow responsible for whatever disaster was unfolding inside. I tipped him another 20, slid into the driver's seat, and took one last look at the Grandview Hotel, at the glass doors and marble facade, and all that expensive architecture that housed expensive people having expensive problems. Then I drove away, leaving behind the wreckage of their success story and the ruins of my marriage, heading toward whatever came next with a phone full of opportunities and a heart that was finally starting to feel lighter than it had in months. Exit, stage left. The show was over, and I'd gotten my standing ovation. By the next morning, every financial paper, tech blog, and business news outlet was screaming the same headline with slightly different variations of corporate panic. Langford Industries crashes, internal sabotage suspected. Tech giant Nexus Data Labs experiences catastrophic system failure. CEO Eric Langford under investigation following anniversary gala disaster. My personal favorite was from TechCrunch. When your infrastructure walks out. The cautionary tale of Nexus Data Labs. I sat at my kitchen table, the one I'd bought from IKEA 3 years ago when Serena and I first moved in together, and I'd spent 4 hours assembling it wrong before starting over, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of orange and gold while my coffee maker gurgled its morning symphony. My apartment felt different now, not emptier exactly, but cleaner somehow, like I'd finally opened all the windows and let the stale air out. The photos of Serena still sat on the shelf, but they looked like artifacts from someone else's life, memories belonging to a version of me that no longer existed. I poured myself a cup of coffee, dark and bitter the way I liked it now instead of the sugary caramel monstrosity Serena used to make fun of me for ordering at Starbucks, and turned on the news. CNN had already picked up the story, running it as their business segment with one of those serious-faced anchors who probably didn't understand half the technical terms she was reading off the teleprompter but was doing her best to look concerned about it. Sources say the company's entire digital infrastructure went offline during what was supposed to be a celebration of their 5th anniversary. The anchor reported, her expression suggesting this was somehow both tragic and mildly scandalous. Multiple clients have already filed complaints with regulatory agencies, and stock prices have plummeted nearly 40% since markets opened this morning. Representatives from Nexus Data Labs were not available for comment, but an internal email leaked to our producers suggests the company is currently unable to access its own systems. I smiled into my coffee mug. Unable to access its own systems. That was one way to put it. Another way would be locked out of the house they thought they owned because they forgot the guy with the keys wasn't actually optional. But corporate speak was never good at admitting fault in clear terms. My phone rang. The display showing Leo's name and his contact photo that was still a picture from our college days when we both had significantly more hair and significantly less understanding of how the real world worked. I answered on the second ring, already grinning because I knew exactly what this call was going to be about. Man, you really logged them out of reality. Leo's voice came through the speaker, loud and delighted and absolutely loving every second of this drama. He'd been my best friend since freshman year when we'd bonded over debugging code at 3 a.m. and arguing about whether tabs or spaces were superior for indentation. I saw the news this morning and I literally spit out my cereal. That was you, wasn't it? Tell me that was you. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, keeping my voice innocently neutral. I just attended a party I wasn't invited to. Whatever happened after that was purely coincidental. Bullshit, Leo laughed. Purely coincidental, my ass. Dude, you're a legend. The entire tech community is talking about this. There are memes already. Someone made a GIF of that primary key missing error message with the caption, "When you forget who built your empire." It's got like 50,000 shares. Really? I pulled up Twitter on my laptop, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, and sure enough, hashtag primary key missing was trending nationally. People were applying it to everything from bad relationships to forgetting passwords to that existential feeling when you realize you've lost something important but can't remember what. It had transcended the original context and become a cultural moment, which was both hilarious and slightly surreal. Guess they should have read the terms and conditions, I said, echoing what I'd told Leo last night when he'd called at midnight, having heard through the grapevine that something massive was going down at the Grandview Hotel. Leo was quiet for a second, then his voice softened slightly, losing some of the excitement and gaining something more sincere. But seriously, how are you doing? I know this whole thing with Serena has been rough. I looked around my apartment, at the space that was slowly becoming just mine again instead of ours. Honestly, better than I've been in months. It's weird, but watching everything fall apart last night felt like closure. Like the universe finally caught up to the scoreboard and realized they'd been crediting the wrong player for all the points. That's deep, man. Very philosophical. Very logged out of toxic relationships and into personal growth. Shut up. I laughed, but it was genuine laughter, the kind I hadn't experienced in a while. The kind that came from actually finding something funny instead of just going through the motions of seeming happy. After I hung up with Leo, I spent the next hour doing something I probably should have done months ago. I went through my phone, my laptop, my cloud storage, and I started deleting photos of Serena and me at company events where she smiled at the camera while mentally calculating her next career move. Screenshots of sweet text messages that turned out to be lies wrapped in emojis. The folder labeled Us that contained 3 years of memories that now felt like evidence in a case I'd already won. Delete, delete, delete. Each one felt like dropping weight I'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it had gotten. Somewhere in that glass tower downtown, in offices that were probably in full crisis mode with emergency meetings and lawyers and PR specialists trying to spin this disaster into something manageable, Serena was realizing something I'd known for months. The difference between power and ownership. She'd had power, the influence, the reputation, the corner office with the nice view. But I'd had ownership, the foundation, the infrastructure, the actual substance that made everything else possible. The backup was nothing without the original. Not just for computer systems, but for relationships, for careers, for any success story built on someone else's work. You can't just extract the value from someone, discard them, and expect everything to keep functioning like they never mattered. Eventually, the system recognizes its creator and refuses to work for anyone else. My phone buzzed again. Another job offer, this one from a startup offering equity and creative control and the kind of respect I should have demanded from the beginning. I added it to the list I'd started last night, a spreadsheet of opportunities that was growing faster than I could review them. Funny how quickly your value becomes apparent when people realize they can't just take it for granted anymore. I deleted another photo. This one from our wedding, both of us smiling like we believed in forever and felt nothing but relief. That version of me, the one who thought love meant sacrifice and compromise and accepting less than I deserved, had been successfully uninstalled. Time for the upgrade. I opened a new document on my laptop, titled it, "What's Next?" and started making plans. Not revenge plans this time, but actual future plans. Projects I wanted to build, companies I wanted to work with, maybe even starting my own thing where I wouldn't have to worry about someone else taking credit for my code. Life 2.0 was downloading, and this version came with better security protocols, stronger boundaries, and a much clearer understanding of my own worth. Outside my window, the city was waking up, going about its business, completely unaware that somewhere in a corporate boardroom, powerful people were learning a very expensive lesson about reading contracts and treating people with basic human decency. The sun was shining, my coffee was still hot, and for the first time in a very long time, I had absolutely no idea what came next. And that uncertainty felt a lot like freedom.